very warm welcome to the World Economic Forum DWTV debate coming to you from India in Delhi. It's widely recognized that our water resources are depleting much faster than we thought. A recent report suggests that worldwide supply and demand, there'll be a gap of some 40% by 2030. In fact, in India, it'll be even more. The deficit is said to be up to 50% within 20 years. That's within our lifetime. India has 16% of the world's population, but only 4% of its water resources. So how does India avert a water crisis? To discuss this, we have a very eloquent panel here for you. People who at various levels are engaged in water issues and from what I can make out also share a passion for finding solutions. Arjun Thaipan is an infrastructure and water advisor, special advisor to the president of the Asian Development Bank in Manila. Ajit Gulabchand is president of Hindustan Construction Company. He's also the co-chair of the India Economic Summit. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission of India. Sanjev Chadha, president of Pepsico in India. And Harish Manawi is the president of Unilever for Asia, Africa, Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you all very much for being here with us. Now, Montek, let's start with you. The government of India is responsible for formulating water policy in India. What is your assessment of the water situation in India and its water security? What are the issues which you think are crucial?
I think water is quite special. I mean, I've often said that the water crisis is actually more serious than the energy crisis. And in both cases, you have the issue of rapidly growing demand with limited supply. I mean, technically, you could say in the case of water that there's virtually no actual growth in supply. The water we have is the same as we had 5,000 years ago. Population has increased, GDP has increased, and all of this requires water. So how you bring these things to equilibrium is a difficult task. And I think it's mainly difficult because in most other things, people are actually willing to pay a price for anything that's scarce. So people expect that if you want energy, you're going to have to pay for it. People don't actually think you have to pay for water. I mean, it's a widespread belief that it's a gift of God and it's a function of governments that they should make water available very, very cheap.
Right. Thank you, Montek. Now, Ajit, you run a very large construction company. What are your initial thoughts on the water situation in India and the role of infrastructure?
Well, as Montek said, we have a water crisis. And as you pointed out, that India would be 50% short of its water requirements in 20 years' time. And whilst that's the bad news, the good news is that it is possible to resolve this. There are solutions for this. However, we need to understand here that in terms of understanding water, we use water very indiscriminately, and therefore we have a crisis. Water is considered only as a social good, whereas water is a social good, it is a commercial good, as well as an environmental good.
Right, thank you very much, Ajit. Now, Harish, you are from one of the biggest consumer companies in India. What is your view as a private sector person as to why the private sector should be involved in this whole water situation?
Everyone talks about two areas of water that we have to manage. You know, the supply side and the demand side. I think there's a lot been said about the supply side. My own view is that that we have to really bring the consumer into play here because there's a demand side that's equally important. Let me give you one example. Our approach, for example, is to say that we must be more holistic and look at, if you like, end-to-end sustainability of everything that we do. What does that mean? If you look at the amount of water, for example, that we consume as a company, our footprint, 65% of that is determined by the use of our products by consumers, to wash clothes, to bathe, so on and so forth. 25% is on the raw material end. We are one of the largest buyers of agricultural products. We buy, for example, 7.5 million tons of agriculture. So what are we trying to do here? What we are saying is, if you look at the supply side of it, which is sourcing of products, we want to make sure that water management is a very important criteria by which we will decide the suppliers of our raw materials.
Thank you very much, Harish. That was a very persuasive argument and a bit of a commercial thrown in there. Now, turning now to Sanjeev. And now, Sanjeev, you are one of the biggest kind of beverage companies in India. What kind of role do you see the private sector playing in finding solutions?
So, what can the private sector do? I think the starting point, to be honest, is to take a mirror and look at themselves and ensure that wastewater which is generated is treated in its entirety. And today, we are far from that. About 60% of the wastewater is currently treated, and 40% is really polluting our aquifers. Having said that, there are 3 or 4 areas where the private sector can play a key role. And it stems from what the private sector stands for: professional management skills and specific competencies in their respective fields. So the first I'd say is, while policy makers understand that water is a key issue, the lay consumer does not. And therefore, really building a burning platform is where I believe it needs to start.
Now, Arjun, you're very familiar with water issues across the region. Put this all in context for us. How is India doing in terms of its water situation compared to the rest of the region?
Not well at all, Amrita. I think if I can step back a bit and post a few numbers for our common benefit. In 1951, a few years after independence, we had a per capita water endowment of about 5,700 cubic meters. That has now declined to less than 1,700, which is the universally accepted norm for water stress. In fact, parts of India are much worse than just water stress. We are water scarce. Tamil Nadu, for example, 400 cubic meters per capita. And this is projected to decline even further. In the next 10 years, we're going to come as a country below 1,000 cubic meters per capita. So I think the first order of business is to see what is it that we can do as a country to not just halt this decline, but in fact reverse it.
Do you think the government of India has understood the true scale of the problem as far as the water situation is concerned? And are they on the right track? You heard what Montek had to say.
I think it has at various levels. If you look at the central level, I mean, Montek's Planning Commission has just posted really recently its midterm appraisal of the 11th plan in regard to water. And I think the writing's very clear. It's abundantly evident to me, at least, that the problems have been identified and the approach to the 12th plan will have to be markedly different. If you look at the states, some are further ahead than others. Karnataka, for instance, is certainly cognizant of what needs to be done in terms of a transformational water agenda over the next 20 years and has begun to take action. But again, this will have to be a combined effort. It will have to be the states as well as the center, enabling an environment framework from the center, plus transformational action plans at state level.
Now, Montek, we've listened to what Arjun had to say. Now, the Indian government has played a very positive role in ensuring water security over the past 150 years, largely in terms of infrastructure. But listening to the fact that we are expecting a gap of 50% between supply and demand in just 20 years, where do you think the major weaknesses lay in your policy which have resulted and are resulting in such a rapid depletion of water in the country?
First, let me say that these estimates of 50% deficit over the next 20 or 30 years really are not worth the paper they're written on, because they are usually based on projections on business as usual. If you had made that projection in 1975 for food, you would have come to the conclusion that there won't be enough food. Malthus came to that conclusion for the whole world in the year 1700 and something. So, long-term projections based on business as usual are really not much use, except to say this is a problem. And by the way, everybody recognizes that's a problem. So the real issue is, what are we going to do about it? Now, I think a couple of things we have to realize. First, probably we have to do much more on the demand side than the supply side. I mean, this is a sort of a mindset shift, because usually the approach is, we've got a problem, we've got a shortage, produce more. I mean, for example, we don't say on food that we somehow have to manage with less food. We say we've got to produce food. And similarly for many things. Not the same for energy, because we say we've got to manage the demand for energy. Water, maybe 2 or 3 times more, we should focus on the demand side. On the supply side, what we have to do is a huge variety of things. Most people think only of big dams, which is certainly important because it impounds water that otherwise runs out to the sea. But much more than that is things like afforestation, is things like watershed management, groundwater recharge, a whole variety of things that the government in different dimensions has to do.
I agree with Montek because at the end of the day, if you go back 25 years, we thought we'll never leapfrog into telecoms because we don't have landlines. And before you know, we are now one of the largest markets for telephony. Now, the point is that there is room here for innovation, and I think there is a lot of room for innovation in terms of efficiencies and so on the supply side. I still believe we must hear the voice of the consumer and the demand side in this. I personally am not quite sure whether, if you were to even ask that farmer, what is it that they need? Do they need to pay for their water but have absolute reliability of getting the water when they want it and the quality of water? I think that we are not understanding the economics of water. What we are understanding is, or what we are dealing with, is the emotion of water. And I do believe there's a lot of upside in terms of demand management. I understand a lot of other countries have done that, from Australia to Thailand and so many others who are addressing this, and I think it can be done. Innovation on the supply side and consumer behavior changes on the demand side.
You talked about growth. Sanjeev, do you think scarcity of water is a business risk for you?
I think it's a business risk for the entire country. Most certainly, yes. I think the important point there is to ensure, again, like Montek and Harish have mentioned, that we are efficient in the way we consume our water, we are responsible in the way industry manages the used water, and we are enterprising and play the right role in terms of impacting a change in the wider spectrum. I'll give you one example of that. You'll be amazed that 1 kilogram of rice requires 3,000 liters of water to produce. And what scientists have been working on with the Punjab Agricultural University is a new mechanism by which you avoid the puddling and are able to save as much as 30 to 40%. If half of the country is able to do puddling or direct seeding by that method, we would save more water than all industry today combined uses. So I think there are many different areas and means, but the core issue, honestly, is in terms of creating those collaborative partnerships to work together. And I think therein lies the issue. We all recognize the problem. Mm-hmm. We all recognize certain solutions which have worked in different pockets. Mm-hmm. But the challenge has been to be able to take those forward in a much surer and faster way. And that is where I think the work lies.
You've raised a lot of very interesting issues, but the two things which stand out very clearly and are here loud and clear is we must manage our demand better, and through efficiencies, particularly in agriculture, because that consumes over 80% of India's water. But Ajit, how does one manage demand?
Well, let's say when we looked at water and wanted to create a situation in our company, can we really conserve a lot of water? And in construction, we took a look at two things. One is, while using water, can we recycle water and set ourselves the goals that every new project we now take, we will consume only 30%. And having succeeded with that, we'll move on to 20%. We found to our astonishment that this very simple idea was so easily doable. In fact, so quickly was it possible to recycle water that the cost of equipment to recycle that water and to clean that water was recovered in a period of 3 to 4 months.
Talking first about pricing, it's a highly volatile issue here in India. As you said, most people are very used to getting water at a very heavily subsidized rate and using it, drawing water out with subsidized electricity. How difficult will it be for you? And you've said this repeatedly, there should be a more rational pricing of water. How difficult will it be for you to actually put that through, get that through with the public?
Well, I think water pricing will be difficult. I don't think it's impossible, by the way. You know, what most people don't realize is that in an urban area, water has to be priced not just to cover the cost of getting the water. It should be priced to cover the cost of treating the sewage. Because as a matter of fact, that is the only way in which you can pay for the sewerage. And most people don't sort of focus on that. And yet, you don't need to focus on it if you're a very small population and the sewerage isn't really making much of a difference to your rivers. But when you've got to our size of population, I mean, people have to recognize that in urban households, they will be, and it's a very straightforward thing. The amount of water you use is directly correlated with the amount of sewage you generate. So you basically pay for both. That's first thing. Second, it's not true, by the way, that private partnerships have not been tried. There are many examples, there are micro examples, where bringing in, I mean, municipalities and urban local bodies have actually achieved 24/7 water supply. So the examples are there. We're late in coming to it, that's true. And I mean, once it becomes recognized that this is probably the only way that you're going to get 24/7 coverage, I've no doubt that it'll spread. But it'll require some political leadership that people will have to, I mean, there's a presumption, that if the state could subsidize the whole thing, I mean, it could be free. But given the many other things the state has to do, there is, in my view, absolutely no justification for subsidizing what is perfectly possible, by the way, to have a metering system where, let's say, if you're concerned about the poor, that the first slab that you charge is very, very low. But, beyond that, you not only charge, but you get them to cross-subsidize the poor. So if you're going to wash your car with water, pay the price for it.
What would you like to see from the government to make businesses or the industry get involved in the water sector, which is till now kind of really risky for most people, but they feel they will not get the returns? What would you like to, Montek is here, what would you like from the government?
So firstly, what I'd say is that while definitely the water sector requires investment, I don't think that is the number one issue or challenge that we are facing. The amount involved, again, as I understand it, is reasonable and it's not outside our means. I think what is required is, again, a mechanism by which there is certainty in terms of water policy going forward. Today it is a political subject, and that political subject is what creates a vulnerability. If you invest in X, 3 years later it becomes Y. Point number one. Point number two, I think, to the point that the other gentleman made, while water is most definitely a human right, I think what is not recognized fully and acknowledged is the importance of the economics of water. And therefore, it is indeed for businesses, whether private or public sector, it is important for them to get a reasonable return on the investment that they are making, not just first off, but on an ongoing basis. And that's what I hear from water utilities as being a major constraining factor. Singapore has something called the PUB, the Public Utilities Board, which was set up 10 years back. And they're a shining example of what an organization or a country can do, small albeit, but great relevant learnings for us as well, in terms of really driving towards water sufficiency.
The non-governmental organizations, often community-based organizations, have been very successful in small areas of India in managing in a sustainable way water resources there. Do you think it is critical that in any kind of policy implementation, any kind of project, that ownership has to be given to the people who are using the resource? Montek?
No, I'm very much in favor of that. I mean, Indian experience does show that at a watershed level or a limited watershed level, remarkable things can be done by doing water conservation, encouraging groundwater recharge, etc. And I think the experience does show that where people are aware that this is going to lead to a benefit and they actually own and are involved in the scheme. It doesn't mean the government has no role. Government can fund it, help, etc., etc. But there's no doubt that the balance of community involvement and participation. When we say community, I mean, it could be community, it could be the elected local councils, what we call the panchayats. So it doesn't have to be civil society. It has to be society, helped by civil society, maybe with the elected local bodies in the lead. I think the evidence shows in many states of India, certainly in parts of Rajasthan, in Gujarat, in Madhya Pradesh, the success achieved has been remarkable. But it needs to now be spread out.
Arjun, looking at it, there's no dearth of ideas, as you see. Everybody's committed. There's great talk about working together, partnerships. Now, you work very closely with water. You are an international pundit on water, if I may say so. Now, what do you think would be the price for India if it does not deal with water scarcity as an urgent issue right now?
I think it would certainly impact on growth. It would certainly impact on quality of life. If you just look at cities as drivers of economic growth, cities which lack world-class water infrastructure are obviously not going to be the same as cities that do have that kind of infrastructure. And I think it's very important to learn lessons from what's happening around us. Montek was talking about wastewater and the cost there being very high. Certainly, look at China's case. China is likely to have half the kind of water gap that India and half the total aggregate consumption that India has by 2030. Let's not get into the nitty-gritty of numbers, Montek. But to get to closing that gap is going to cost China 4 times as much as India, conservatively, simply because China's problem is water quality, India's problem is efficiencies in irrigated agriculture. So that's the kind of very important lesson I think we need to learn as we are beginning to rapidly urbanize and rapidly industrialize.
Now, may I ask people of the audience if any of you would like to ask questions?
I would like to make sure that there's some discussion between the interface of water and women.
Water and?
And women.
Yes. Thank you. I'm very pleased you asked that.
We know and we see that when there is a gap between demand and supply, there is a differential impact between men and women. Women suffer most, they pay most. Now that you have mentioned that a new water policy is being formulated, my interest is to learn how this formulation is kind of taking stock of what the implication of this policy would or would not be on women, and how would the women's situation be addressed through the new policy vis-a-vis water.
Well, you know, we are adopting an extremely inclusive approach and inviting both men and women to give us input. So we're not discriminating in favor of one or the other, but we are very aware that in certainly all the rural areas, the overwhelming burden of getting water falls on women. And therefore, anything that leads to an easing of access to drinking water would be hugely more beneficial for the women. And as a matter of fact, the way this gets reflected in decision-making is that in the local elected village councils, the panchayats, I mean, there's now almost a 50% reservation for women in most states. So there are a lot of women present. And we expect that since these are the councils that determine how money at the local level should be used, that they will sooner or later be using their numerical strength to make sure that schemes that deliver water would receive priority.
Just a factual thing, what targets have the government set for the next 5 years and for the next 10 years? Because as much as these ideas are very good, I'd like to know what's being done in practice.
As I said, we're coming to the end of what we call the 11th five-year plan, which finishes in the year 2012. The next five-year plan begins in the year 2013. So we're working towards that, and therefore targets will be set before the plan period starts. A lot of the focusing on water-related issues and the targets associated with that will be part of the 12th plan, but we're still working on it, so there are no targets at the moment that I can share.
Can I just add to that? I think this is a really important question. At the end, you get what you measure and your targets. Just to tell you, and I'm sure that all my colleagues sitting here and many here will agree, as a company also, we have a very clear target. For example, we talk about doubling our business, we're talking about reducing our environmental impact end to end. And this is something that we are going to be announcing formally tomorrow, because we think unless we commit ourselves and also give you a metric by which you can measure our impact. And many companies are coming forward to say, hold us responsible for this is what for this. But the important thing is it has to be in the context of growth.
I don't know who wants to take up on the question, comment on how the water scarcity might actually evolve into kind of water conflicts in this region.
Could we ask Arjun to answer that? I mean, 10 major rivers from the Tibetan plateau feeding a quarter of the world's population in Asia, and no discussion of that. What would you like to add?
I certainly think we're going to have to be mindful of the fact that there is potential for conflict in the Himalayan basins. But I think we also need to take heart from arrangements such as the Indus Waters Treaty, which has done very well for both India and Pakistan over 50 years or more now. So I think what we really need to work on is simple but effective arrangements for transboundary water management. 40% or more of our accessible freshwater resources globally, and about the same figure for Asia, are in shared river basins. So there's no getting away from the fact that with urbanization, with industrialization, with higher intensities in terms of pollution, you will have to be looking for more effective ways of collaborating across countries, across boundaries.
What's been very clear in this debate, that there is general agreement that there is a problem in the water situation of India. There's also broad agreement that urgent action needs to be taken in terms of implementation and policy, in terms of getting the private sector involved, in terms of drawing on local organizations, in effect, getting a collaborative effort in dealing with an impending water scarcity, not just in India, but in the world. You were watching the World Economic Forum DWTV debate coming to you from Delhi in India. I'm Amrita Cheema. Great to have you with us.